Hello there, good morning, and welcome along to the first ever edition of Front Page with me, Noah Keate. Now, you may have stumbled across this video on your YouTube channel or Facebook feed completely by accident, so allow me to introduce myself. I'm Noah Keate. I'm a first-year politics student at the University of Warwick, and this is my new radio show. I've appeared on Raw 12:51 AM a number of times over the previous months. I think my first appearance was on the Perspectives podcast back in November last year, which is linked to the highly successful Perspectives website and magazine. And if I remember correctly, it was a general election special, which just centuries ago. Since then, I've appeared on Insight, which is the flagship political news show here on Raw 12:51 AM. We have a good old-fashioned debate and plenty of speculations and reflections on the political news that's affected both the UK and the rest of the world. And I've also appeared on the Johnny Jenkins Show too, which airs every Friday afternoon from 3 PM, when we reflect on the previous week and look ahead to the weekend and what future weeks will offer. But this is something a bit different. I've been handed the levers of power, the reins of the Raw News YouTube channel and Facebook page for 1 hour only every week, a chance to offer my own opinions and views. I'll be reflecting really on what's been going on in the world, the good and the bad, and just the truly brilliant things and the awful things as well for 1 hour. I'll be offering my opinions and also speculating on what the future could hold. I'll also be looking through the front pages, hence the title, of some of the main newspapers, both the tabloids and the broadsheets, to reflect on what they both reveal and don't reveal really about the news that's shaping the world. But don't worry, it's not all going to be politics, much as I love politics, I'm obsessed with it. There'll also be some culture as well. I've got a book recommendation every week where I'll provide both, it might be fiction or it might be non-fiction. I'll provide my opinion on it and why I believe that you should read it. In my spare time, I do love listening to podcasts, so I'll also offer a podcast recommendation of the week that I also think's worth your time. And as some of you may know, I'm on Twitter quite a lot. I do spend a lot of my spare time on Twitter, so I'll be offering my own tweeter that you should follow and who should make your timeline that bit more positive and enjoyable to look through if you spend lots of your time like me looking through Twitter. Now, as I said before, lots of the show is going to be based on my own opinions. I can't promise that my opinions are right or correct. I do try to base what I think and what I write and what I say off the facts and off evidence. But of course, that could be wrong. There could be other, whether it's graphs and coronavirus or other evidence that's contrary to what I think. And I'm open to challenges. After all, aren't minds for changing? So that's why I'd love you to get involved. There aren't going to be any guests on this show, but you can comment down below, whether it's on Facebook or on YouTube. I'll be able to read through the comments and read them out if they're appropriate. And I'd love, whether you agree with what I have to say or whether you disagree with what I have to say, I'd love to hear from you and see what you think about the defining issues that are shaping our world. Now, you'll have noticed that this is a morning show. Lots of the other shows have appeared on, whether it was back when we were at Warwick in the studios or on the online world that Raw and all the other networks have transferred onto. Lots of their shows are in the afternoon, so I do apologise in advance if you've had to wake up a little bit early to try and listen to this, but I do appreciate it. And I realise that I might inadvertently be providing some structure in your day. You may be a furloughed employee who's now having your wages, or at least 80% of your wages, paid for by the government. You might be a first-year student like me with very little to do apart from a few essays to submit in a few weeks. Or you might be a second or third-year student, or even a postgraduate with online exams imminently to look forward to or dread, depending on your perspective. But I hope I can provide a bit of structure in your day every Monday morning from 10 o'clock, as I say, either for 1 hour or depending on how much I have to say, how many opinions I have to hold. We'll see how it goes over the next hour. But above all, I hope you can enjoy it. And I hope that whoever you are, wherever you are, we can have that bit of clarity and a look at the week that tries to be both informal, because after all, this is a radio show. This is to be enjoyed and also informative at the same time. Now, you won't be surprised to hear that much of my discussion over the next hour is going to be about the coronavirus. It's dominating all the radio stations that I listen to, because you'll be shocked to hear that I listen to radio stations other than Raw 12:51 AM, all the speech stations, 24/7 coronavirus coverage. But almost one of the only good things about coronavirus is that there are so many angles in which to cover it. You're never going to get bored, because there are simply so many ways to look at this virus that has affected the world so much. You'll also notice I do have my tea. I think it's a bit too early for any other beverage of any other kind, but of course tea is a suitable beverage, whether it's 1 AM or 10 AM. So do drink along your beverage with me. No sponsorship by any company, just me and what I like to drink. And I want to start by talking about coronavirus by going backwards, really. Much of the discussion in the media is very much focused on the present day, and that's no bad thing. Every day there are hundreds of deaths, hundreds, thousands of deaths around the world, which are tragic. I want to start talking about going back really to the beginning of 2020, because I think the 2020s were seen as something new, though I think time is something that's socially constructed by humans to sort of find a sense of meaning within an uncertain world. I mean, that philosophy podcast is for another week. There was a sense that 2019 was the end of something and 2020 was the beginning of something. In the 19th or the 20th century, we had the Roaring Twenties. Of course, look how they ended. And there was a real sense that the 2020s and 2020 itself was going to be something new. Boris Johnson, like him or loathe him, had just won a decisive majority in the 2019 general election. Across Europe, there are plenty of challenges to face, like migration, climate change, which is, of course, a global issue. But there was a sense that for whatever challenges the world faced, this new decade would be a chance to look forward and go together in trying to resolve them. So I remember New Year's Eve at the end of 2019 saying, I hope this has been a good year for you, but let's see what the next decade holds. And it's clear that it's not been a brilliant decade so far. Right at the start of the year, we had the US killing of an Iranian general who seemed like a loathsome individual, but that meant that geopolitical relations that were already unstable became even more unstable. We then had wildfires across Australia for much of January and even into February. And I remember that really dominating the news in a very depressing way. And then we began to hear this story about this coronavirus. And I remember hearing it, as I say, on another radio station within the news bulletin. But it was very much focused on being within China, within Wuhan. It would be about the third or fourth item on the agenda. And I remember you'd hear that the death toll was increasing, the number of people that were infected with the virus increasing, and it did seem incredibly depressing. I think it began around the time of the Chinese New Year, because I think they take a holiday or they take a period of time to reflect and enjoy the Chinese New Year. And the only reason I remember that is because the holiday that they had was extended beyond the normal period of time. So when you would have been used to seeing the transport busy again in Beijing or wherever across China, with people getting ready to go back to work, that clearly wasn't the case. So the Chinese people and the state was in their own form of lockdown because of this awful coronavirus. And I think maybe I was slightly naive in my thinking, but I saw it as an issue that was happening elsewhere. It was something that was happening elsewhere, and it was going to affect people that were elsewhere. It certainly hadn't been called a pandemic. It was seen very much as a domestic issue. That was certainly how maybe the media did or didn't present it that way, but that was how I interpreted it. And as I say, maybe I was naive for thinking like that. I should have perhaps better assessed that this was going to be a problem that was not just going to affect one country and that would spread across the entire world. And obviously the Chinese government, they have to pay their fair share in being held to account for this. It seems that there were doctors who recognised towards the start of the new year that this was not just a normal virus. It wasn't just a case of normal pneumonia, however normal that can be. They realised it was something different that could. And it seems initially that their information and their realizations were censored by the Chinese government, and they were made to apologize for what they'd said. I remember one of the doctors who had been early in his criticisms and realizations that this was something new, then sadly tragically died from the coronavirus themselves. And so it just shows how obviously a virus is going to be tricky for any government to tackle, but it shows how that the Chinese government's inability to deal with it effectively and immediately maybe meant that it spread even more than it otherwise would have. And I think this means that they have to be held to account for it. Certainly within the UK, there was very much a sense that this was something that was happening elsewhere. And as I say, it wouldn't be an issue that was going to affect the rest of us. I think generally, sorry, you might see me looking down during this broadcast, and it is because I have got notes. So if I was doing this properly on the radio, obviously you don't have to have a face, but I like being seen. But I've got notes here, so if I am looking down, it's not because I'm ignoring you, it's just because I'm trying to make sure I've got lots of thoughts, and I do like to write them down, as those of you who read my articles might know. And so it was a sense that, yeah, it was something that wasn't going to happen in the UK. And really, for myself, there are only 3 moments where the virus became real for me, real in, whatever sense it can be. And I think the first was when about 30 or 40 people were returning to the UK from China. And what happened was that they were tested for whether they had the COVID-19 coronavirus. And if I remember correctly, all of them tested negatively. None of them had it. But the very fact they were tested, so this was something real, something that could happen within the UK. And as I say, I was probably deeply naive, but just the fact that those people had been tested in the UK showed that it was possible for individuals to catch the coronavirus, and it to truly be something that was a worldwide issue. And the second moment was when I think a student at the University of York was tested positive for coronavirus. I applied to York University, or somewhere where I could have gone, and it seemed somewhere that was very near and very real. And that just made me think, if it happened at York University, why couldn't it happen at Warwick University or any other university? I think, ironically, the Warwick term ended at the perfect occasion for the Easter break, because it was only about a week afterwards that the UK then entered into its lockdown. But it made me think, if someone at one university can get it, universities are hotbeds, you get tens of thousands of students every day across a campus or across a city communicating, going to lectures, and it's almost the perfect place, if you think about it in an awful sense, for a virus spread. And the third moment when the virus really became real, and I thought this is something that's going to affect the UK quite seriously for the long term, was when the Health Minister, Nadine Dorries, was tested positive for coronavirus. It was at a moment just as I was trying to get to bed. I do that awful thing where I have one last look through Twitter at the sort of key news stories of the day at 10 o'clock, and then I try to switch off my phone and head to sleep. And it was just as I was about to switch off my phone that I saw the Health Minister, Nadine Dorries, had tested positive, and that just made me think, oh my goodness, this is someone who's a member of Parliament, an elected representative, and members of Parliament, they see hundreds, if not thousands of people every week, whether it's in Parliament, in meetings in Westminster, or in their constituencies. They're almost the perfect, I remember they were called, was it super catchers or something, for spreading the virus. And it was once she got it, she had to go into self-isolation. And that made me think, well, if she's had it, she could have met with the Prime Minister, communicated with the Prime Minister. Why wouldn't he get it? And of course, the rest is history. But the issue of the coronavirus spreading internationally, I remember it was South Korea, Iran, and Italy that were places that were, affected in quite the early stages of the coronavirus before the UK. That just shows how something that originated in China could become international. And I think there will have to be repercussions for the UK's relationship with the Chinese government after this. Obviously, we were already having quite a close relationship with the Chinese government under David Cameron and George Osborne, whether it was to do with nuclear power, and I think the Hinkley Point power station, you might have to correct me if I'm not right, but also the 5G network and the Huawei acting as a company that was going to be invested and rolled out across the UK. I think that relationship will have to change. I must admit, I was very supportive of the 5G network initially. I thought that the UK government, whether under New Labour or the coalition government, had failed to effectively invest in 5G. I must admit, I don't really fully understand it, but I recognise that it's a real step up from 4G in terms of our communication. And I thought if the UK was going to be at the forefront of innovation and technological evolution, then 5G was going to be needed, and that Huawei, because of the failures of the British government, was going to have to play a part in that. And obviously there was a vote in Parliament, a widespread opposition, but the vote did pass, or the vote that would have prevented the 5G network from Huawei did fail to pass. And so I think that shows how ministers were willing to go ahead with this network. It was not going to be in the more secretive or sensitive aspect of the UK security. And so I thought it was an effective compromise. But I must admit, my view is slightly changed now. I do wonder whether the Chinese government, they're shown to have suppressed the figures for the true number of deaths in Wuhan by I think around 50%. And they're also quite slow at sharing any information they had with other countries when it became clear that they would be affected by the coronavirus as well as them. So obviously in the forefront of the Prime Minister's mind today as he returns to work will be the immediate situation within the UK and trying to prevent a second peak when the UK does leave lockdown. But I think at the back of their mind, the geopolitical tensions and relations with other nations will always have to stay. The UK always has to deal with governments and regimes that are truly abhorrent. That's just part of living in a globalised world. And while I fully support a globalised world, I'm a big fan of globalisation. I recognise that means you have to deal with vile regimes. And so I think inevitably the close relationship that David Cameron and George Osborne established with the Chinese government and their one-party state, I think that's going to have to change after we leave lockdown, and while people like Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, can consider our relationship with China. So as I say, while the immediate situation will be focusing on the health concerns within the UK, a more wider concern for the government has to be its foreign policy relations. Now, let's have a look at your comments. I've seen some of you have been commenting. Hello, says Enoch, our fine head of news. Morning, Noah. Johnny Jenkins as well, commenting along. My good friend Alex Elbro. Hi, Noah. Good job, Noah. Billy Lucas. And Alex Elbro says, I think most of us saw COVID-19 not as a problem for us, how wrong we were. Well, you're right. I think we really did see it as something that was a story. It was definitely a news story being talked about from January, but it was, again, the seriousness or the severity of a news story can be worked out by how high it is up a news bulletin or a news agenda. And I think that just really wasn't high up there. It was third or fourth, but it just wasn't seen as a serious priority. And some other fine radio presenters saying that they both use notes, and that's very reassuring, because while I do have lots of views and I can talk a lot, it can be easy to sometimes forget, or your mind to go blank just as you're on air and you think, what on earth do I want to say? Now, I do want to take a first look at some of the papers. I can't afford to buy all the newspapers, so thanks to the brilliance of the BBC Papers website, I can get a look at the front pages. The Metro this morning, the free newspaper that you'd probably be used to seeing if you ever had a train commute to London, or whenever I went to visit London for the day, an exciting day out, we'd always see the Metro on the trains, and that's why I thought I'm really in the capital. So that's one of the many reasons why I want to live in London when I'm older. They lead today with Boris back at number 10. So they have a photo of Boris Johnson through the gates of Downing Street, that sort of sense of protection, with a security guard or another individual returning from Chequers, where he'd been in recovery after leaving intensive care. And it says that the PM is at the helm again just 3 weeks after fighting for his life, which shows how it was so serious. And the Metro, they put a picture of their old front page when the Prime Minister had just entered intensive care 3 weeks ago, and there's that real sense of a return of governance from the Prime Minister. We had Dominic Raab leading, he stood in for Boris Johnson at Prime Minister's questions, but there's a sense that Boris Johnson, presumably on the advice of his health officials and doctors as well, feels that he can get back into leading from the front. And it's interesting really whether the Prime Minister being back will affect the UK's response, because although in our constitution we don't have something for someone standing in when the Prime Minister can't do their job, should it really be that one figure actually changes the sort of the way that the UK responds and how we're able to affect the number of cases? The Daily Express today, they say that they're backing NHS and care heroes across their top banner. Boris, I'll get Britain moving but won't risk lives. So it's a sense very much that he wants to get the UK back into, well, he's done a news briefing this morning saying that he doesn't want to rush back into ending the lockdown. And their report says that Boris Johnson returns to work today to begin leading the country out of lockdown while vowing to prevent a second wave of cases. Well, that's a really worrying thing, is that we leave lockdown, go back into our normal lives, and could very easily end up, communicating with one another again. And therefore, the number of cases that I think the number of cases has slightly been going down, but I'm not sure how much reliability you can place on that, because there's normally fewer cases reported at the weekends. But you might know, do let me know, I'm very happy to be corrected. And then a story about Strictly Come Dancing, which I used to watch a lot. And Captain Tom, my 100,000 thank yous to the great British public, on the front page of the Express. And that's for Tom, the captain who had walked, I think, was it 100 laps of his garden to celebrate just before his 100th birthday, raising over, I think, 27 million for the NHS, which is truly brilliant. And there he is, I think, celebrating with some champagne. Because it's the Daily Express, there's often weather stories. They have after glorious April, get set for a May washout. Well, I think we need some rain, and it looks as if I'm in Cambridge, my home, where it looks as if it's going to be raining from Tuesday, I believe, and I'm very pleased about that. Because obviously there's a real distinction between the weather and the climate, and anyone who tells you they're the same is incorrect. But it's clear that while we can enjoy the hot summers, which, I mean, it's not great if you're jogging, but that's beside the point. We can enjoy the hot summers. That is worrying for the climate overall. If you see a trend over 30 years with the average temperature in April increasing and increasing, that is worrying. The Daily Mail today saying that the Prime Minister returns to number 10 after his brush with death. And I mean, it does show you how serious Boris Johnson's condition was. If you get moved to intensive care, well, the clue is sort of in the name. It's not, you're in a damaging situation. It looks as though he really was on the edge. And their key headline, Boris bounces back to get the UK moving. So that's very similar to the Daily Express story in a sense of optimism and trying to renew the UK's spirits. I'm not sure really how much demand there is for leaving the lockdown from the public, and I don't think the coronavirus is something that should be shaped by immediate citizen demands and constantly looking at opinion polls on what the public have to say. I think that's quite a damaging or worrying way to look at something. I think in a crisis like this, a government has to lead from the front, but I would be interested to see if there is polling that suggests that the UK and the public are bored of being in lockdown for so long. Because from what I've seen, the lockdown was almost one of the most popular policies the government has ever enacted. It seemed to have, almost universal support, mainly for going into this lockdown where we had our movements restricted, which I think is a very interesting thing in itself. The Daily Mail also say that he'll take full control of the corona fight today. I mean, I hate the comparisons between the coronavirus and Brexit. They're completely different things. But having said that, that full control, it does sort of remind me of that take back control notion that was a key part of the Brexit campaign of 2016 and then all the arguments about Brexit in the years since. And they also have a Weight Watchers feature in the Mail, how to have a lighter lockdown, lose up to a stone for the summer. Oh, fantastic. It's a very nice, healthy food, but how easy it is to make, in reality, I'm not entirely sure. It looks the sort of thing that might be easier said than done. Someone's commented on YouTube, the CMP movies says the government claims we are past the peak. Well, yes, I think we have seen, a spike in 700, 800 deaths a day, and it does look as though it's slightly falling number of deaths. So of course, remember that I think that's just deaths in hospitals, and so whether they include deaths in care homes, I'm not entirely sure. But I think you're right, there has been a sort of general trend, maybe decreasing, don't quote me on that. But I think we definitely want to see a broader trend of it decreasing before we think about easing the lockdown. And you have to remember, even when we do ease the lockdown, it will be in stages. So having talked about the Chinese government and how the sort of coronavirus initially started and the way it seemed to escape our attention for many months, and certainly escaped mine, I wanted to move on to talk about the UK's response initially, because I think one of the tragic things about the UK's government, the government's response in the UK, was the amount of flexibility and time we had. Obviously, I'll just have some tea. Tea makes everything better, which I do think is true. So, obviously, no government is going to respond perfectly to any virus like this. It's a pandemic which is going to shape across the world, and the state can only is limited in what it can do a lot, but it's limited in the idea that it can solve everything. But the UK did have some time. We had seen that other countries were affected before ourselves, whether it was China or, as I say, places like Iran, Italy, and then when the virus headed east towards America, there was this notion that clearly countries of all populations were going to eventually be infected with the virus, and then the government would need to have a proper response to it. And there was lots of talk initially, not necessarily within the government, but within the media, about this idea of herd immunity. Now, I don't think this was a policy ever followed by the government, but the very fact they let it be talked about as if it could be a government policy just shows their lack of strength in responding effectively to the virus. And I think herd immunity would have been the complete incorrect response. While it may have meant we wouldn't have entered lockdown, it would have been very much a survival of the fittest. In order to ensure that people meeting were immune, you would have had to accept the deaths of tens of thousands of people. I think the government's own reports, other reports, suggest that the NHS would have been overwhelmed by the number of cases and simply unable to deal with it. It shows that that policy should have been a non-starter. And as I say, I don't think it ever officially was government policy, but the very fact the government allowed it to enter the discussion shows that they weren't willing to respond appropriately to it. And it's interesting because I think government reports had shown that the pandemic was the number one threat potentially facing the UK, a virus, I think maybe written in 2016, 2017, long before COVID-19 had ever been heard of. There was this sense that a pandemic would be something that was going to affect the UK. And so it just suggests what planning could have been done. Is there anything more that the government could have done in trying to sort out its response and work out how the UK was going to be protected from it? And I think there was maybe 7 or 10, perhaps even longer than 10 days. I remember last week, the Sunday Times, in their report, said that we'd lost 38 days in our response from the first sort of main COBRA meetings to eventually going into lockdown towards the end of March. And I think it links initially to Boris Johnson's instinctively libertarian attitudes. You know, he is sort of more of a libertarian conservative. He was one of the early supporters of gay marriage, and he was one of the sort of proud supporters of individuals and wanted to limit the state's involvement in their lives. And I think in the last election campaign, he only embraced a wider role for the state because his campaign team told him that that was what would win him votes in those key sort of red wall seats in the north of England. And so I think that desire not to encroach too much on people's individual freedoms meant the time that we could have had that flexibility if we'd gone into lockdown 10 days earlier meant we lost that time, and therefore we still have had to end up in lockdown. Initially it was schools shutting, and then it became people only being allowed to move if they were going to work, if they were going shopping, if they were going out for exercise or helping a vulnerable person. We still ended up in the position that Boris Johnson probably didn't want to end up in. But if maybe we've done it earlier, it might not have changed things. It might have changed things. But there was a real sense, there was a literal decisive action of what he wanted to do. So it shows that despite wanting to not end up in lockdown, we still ended up there. And I think this will all have to come out in the inquiry that will inevitably take place after, well, if there'll ever be after coronavirus stage, it might be a risk that's with us for many decades to come. There'll probably be lots of multiple inquiries going on at the same time into the health response the government wants it, and how they may have acted too slowly, or maybe they were correct. But I mean, obviously we can't make official judgments, but I think it's important that we scrutinise the government as the virus is going on and not just leave it to when the UK is officially out of lockdown. And I think it's also important to look at, compare it to other countries. Obviously that's tricky to do. Countries will have different populations and different ways of dealing with the virus. And I do like to compare the UK's approach to New Zealand, which I know is tricky to do. New Zealand has a population of 4 million, we have a population of 60 million. But what the New Zealand government did is they almost went into lockdown straight away, even maybe before the first case had been reported. There'd maybe only been 2 or 3 cases reported. And the New Zealand government were willing to go into lockdown and sort of unite the country together in trying to defeat the virus. And as a result, they've had hardly any deaths. Now, of course, they have been advantaged by not being landlocked to any other country. But then, well, so is the UK, apart from Northern Ireland being linked to the Republic of Ireland. And they've also been, I think, had a more competent government. Certainly Jacinda Ardern looks like someone who's leading from the front and who's decisive about what she wants to do. And therefore, the comparison to the UK is, I think, completely different. I think we also have to accept that, yeah, we were going to enter lockdown probably inevitably at any stage. I think the only exception has been somewhere like Sweden, where they've been more lax in their restrictions. And I think people in Sweden have probably entered into lockdown voluntarily, even though there's been no government action telling them that they have to. I think they've chosen by choice to maybe socially distance. There might still be gatherings, but they're far smaller. But I remember listening to a podcast that said within Sweden they have the highest percentage of the population who live alone, so therefore that would reduce the spread of the virus, and also the highest percentage of the population either within Europe or elsewhere that work from home. So inevitably it means they wouldn't have to go into an office to communicate with other people. So I think this is something that has to be looked at within a particular context, and sadly we're only going to see the death toll go up for the foreseeable future, even if the rate of deaths is decreasing by each day. That doesn't mean the deaths in themselves will stop for a very long time. I think that's both depressing and a realistic scenario that we have to live with. So now I've talked about the UK's response, I want to enter into a bit of a cultural discussion, so with my book of the week. And so I thought, as this is the first sort of radio, television show I've ever done, so I'm easing myself gently into the media world, as this is the first one I was doing, I thought it would be only appropriate to recommend the first political book I really remember buying. So I'll just get it out of shot here. And it's called Coalition, the Inside Story of the Conservative Liberal Democrat Coalition Government, and it's by David Laws. Now, I may have bought political books before this one, but this was the first one that, when I spring to mind, I think, what was the first political book I remember purchasing when I was really interested in politics? This is the one that definitely springs into my head, and it's by David Laws, who was a Liberal Democrat minister in the coalition government. I think he was an education minister before losing his seat in 2015. And it's a really, really fantastic account of the coalition years. It details everything from 2010 to 2015, all the way from the coalition negotiations in 2010. They're talking about tuition fees, which obviously for students watching, you'll know all about. I do have a slightly controversial opinion in that I support tuition fees and think they're progressive, but that's for another show. And it goes all the way on to talking about equal marriage, which David Cameron introduced with the Liberal Democrats. The political situation of Nick Clegg, who went in the 2010 election campaign to being one of the most popular leaders since Churchill, to gradually decreasing in his popularity and eventually losing 47 seats in 2015. It talks about all kinds of domestic issues, spending cuts, military strikes, rows, referendums, the London riots, the different debates within cabinet that took place and shaped how they formed their government and how they made their decisions. And I think many people thought the coalition government wouldn't even last 1 year, but it did last all 5 years. And so in that sense, it was far more successful than people would believe it to be. Obviously, across Europe, many governments are used to being coalitions. Their electoral systems, which are more proportional, mean that two or three parties, sometimes even a super coalition of groups, inevitably have to work together. And that's different in the UK. It's been the first hung parliament in 2010 since 1974, February 1974. Of course, we've been used to a hung parliament since then in 2017. But I think it's a really riveting account, and it looks at the heart of both the personalities and the policies. Obviously, David Laws will want to present the Liberal Democrat perspective because that's his party, that's inevitable. But even in doing that, he still manages to get a sense of objectivity within his work, and it's a very tricky thing to weave together. So obviously he talks in the end, I think there's a section, a sort of an appendix section devoted to the Liberal Democrats on what they achieved and why it was the right thing for them to go into government, which I believe it was. I believe they both had no choice, and it would have been a dereliction of their duty not to enter into the coalition government. But it's a really great photo as well. I do like a photo or three or four within any political book. And so great photos, great writing as well. I'll just put this down here because it's quite heavy. It's nearly 600 pages. So if you do end up reading it, it's going to take up a lot of your time in lockdown, which might be welcomed. So it's, really, really enjoyable. I think often that the coalition government in David Cameron's first term as Prime Minister is very easily forgotten when we look back on recent political history. I think it's partially because he's remembered so much and will always be remembered for Brexit and the European Union referendum and the aftermath of that, which Theresa May and Boris Johnson have then had to deal with. But I think that's poor in a way. It's poor for both historians and for political reporters to forget that 2010 to 2015 government, because they were extremely significant. Whether you agree with their proposals and thought austerity was a necessity, I didn't think it was a necessity. I'm not a free marketeer. I support the state investing in the economy. I think that's an effective way for both potentially increasing employment and ensuring that both tax revenue is raised and that the economy can be sustainable. Whatever your view on it, though, is presented in a fantastic way. And I think we have a duty to look at the decisions that led David Cameron both to eventually promising an EU referendum if he won the 2015 election, and the policies he made beforehand, 2010 to 2015, which we're seeing the aftermath of. We're reaping what we saw then in 2010 to 2015 in the post-premiership with Theresa May and then Boris Johnson. So David Laws' coalition book is really worth your time, even though it is 600 pages. But I think 20 or 30 of those are the index, which if you like to look up a specific person is very important. Enoch commented earlier to say he thinks there's a distinction between being bored of lockdown and wanting to leave it. Well, it's very interesting that, because I think boredom and indifference to the events are the emotions that I'm experiencing the least. I both personally have plenty to keep me busy, whether it's doing things like this, writing for the Ball, which is the good friend of the Raw radio station, the Ball student newspaper at the University of Warwick, whether it's writing for them, writing my blog, or dreaded essays to complete. I have plenty to keep me busy, thankfully, and lots of cultural things to watch. And I also feel both busy and deeply sad, and I'm worried not for myself, but for family members who are in their more mature years and other people, the daily death toll. So it's interesting. Boredom is personally what I'm experiencing the least. I'm very happy to just go outside once a day and do my attempt at jogging and trying to get that daily exercise that the government recommends. But isn't so people may be bored of lockdown, but that, yes, as you say, it doesn't necessarily mean that they want to leave it. I think we'll have to look at the polling for that. You've had lots of some Tory MPs, Tory groups saying they want to start easing the lockdown for fear of the economic risks, which I'll come on to a bit later on, because I think there's a real simplification between the health versus economy debate. I think that's far too simple and far too easy way to look at the issues affecting coronavirus, which affects lots of other issues too. Johnny Jenkins just says he's bought Coalition second hand. Well, very good. I think I bought it first hand from a shop. I saw it in hardback and I thought, I've got to get this. You know, I was obsessed with politics. I remember what got me interested in politics was watching the 2015 general election coverage a few months after it had occurred. I just thought this is an election night that just looks brilliant and wild. It wasn't brilliant because of who won. I wasn't that concerned. It was just the fact the BBC coverage. I thought this is something I want to be interested in and I will be interested in for the rest of my life. And so far, that's proven the case. But yeah, it's a really good read. There's so many books on my to be read list that are both fiction and non-fiction. I'm on my third mug of tea for the day, which I think is perfectly normal, but some of you might disagree. Let's take a look at some more of the front pages, some broadsheets as well as the tabloids and mid-market publications that we looked at earlier. Daily Telegraph, which always has a very busy front page, leads with Johnson to ease the lockdown this week, and they say the Prime Minister is expected to announce plans to modify restrictions as he makes his return to number 10. Well, it's interesting in the press, not the press conference, but in a speech he gave outside Downing Street just before I came on air, saying that he wasn't going to speculate or give information about when to end the lockdown because of his fears of there being a second spike of the coronavirus if it was eased too quickly. And I wonder to what extent that's shaped by his own personal experience. If you've had a near-death experience with coronavirus, surely that would affect your perspective on it, both for other people and wanting the best for your country. I'm sure he'll have spoken to his advisors, spoken to the scientists to try and determine what to do. But I think inevitably you are going to be subjectively shaped by that emotional and grueling health experience, and you'd almost not be human if you weren't affected by it. So in that sense, I think it's perfectly understandable. But it's interesting they say he's going to ease the lockdown, because certainly in the speech, I didn't get that impression. Maybe you did. If you agree or disagree, do comment on Facebook or YouTube. I'd love to read them. They also have a Daily Telegraph, a Health on Monday feature, again talking about weight, like the Daily Mail did, and posing lots of questions saying, how long does it really take to get over coronavirus? How do we beat lockdown back pain? And oh dear, there's even this question that says, it feels like Russian roulette. Do I want COVID-19 or cancer? Well, that shows the awful situation some people are having to put themselves in, where they feel that because GPs and other hospitals are inevitably focused on the outbreak, they feel that other issues and other health issues that won't go away, will never go away, are almost put to one side. Now, that might not be the case, but the fact that the perception is there is very worrying indeed. Other stories in the Daily Telegraph include furloughed staff are urged to pick fruit amid the farming crisis. Well, that's interesting because it's as though you have many seasonal workers from Eastern Europe that come over and do picking fruit. I'm in East Anglia. There's lots of farms around here. And certainly we have furloughed staff that have got more time on their hands. I can see why the government would want to meet that shortfall of people not coming over from other countries, and basically saying that people in the UK need to pick fruit. If we want to buy it in our supermarket, someone's going to have to pick it, and we should be willing to do it. Having said that, maybe that means I should be willing to do it, given apart from a few essays and this, I've not got a lot of things on my hands. Wormwood scrubs in the Telegraph, prisons to make PPE. Well, I can't read this full story, but that would suggest prisoners, trying to use their time inside productively. I'm all supportive of that if they're given the right training and right equipment. If it means they can make PPE, which we so desperately need, I think that's no bad thing. It says Hancock is too late to hit his testing target. This probably refers to Matt Hancock, the health secretary, all about trying to reach 100,000 tests per day by the end of April. Now, the issue that I need clarity on is, was his target for 100,000 people to actually be tested each day, or for the UK to have the capacity to test 100,000 people each day? Because the two things are very different. You might not need to test 100,000 people a day, but it's all about if you have the capacity to do it, then it's good, but it's not the same as actually testing. So I need a bit more clarity on that. And that does raise questions of whether Matt Hancock should resign if he fails to meet this target. I don't think he should. I don't think it's a brilliant idea to have a health secretary resigning in the middle of a health pandemic crisis. And I think he's so far been quite effective in his response to it, and so I don't think that would be the right decision. Some smaller stories on the front page of the Telegraph. NEC Hospital yet to see a patient after 10 days. And this refers to the new Nightingale Hospital in Birmingham, so not far from the Warwick University campus. Well, I think that's brilliant. It's great that they had the capacity and they were able to make this new hospital in such building had already been built, but put all the beds in such a short space of time. And it should be fantastic and welcome if they've not needed to have a patient. I think that's what one of the issues, if the government had followed a herd immunity strategy, that's what one of the issues would have been. You'd had these new hospitals created, but they probably still wouldn't have been enough if people were just meeting each other and mingling every single day. Call for domestic abuse safe spaces in stores. Well, this of course links to the tragedy. Domestic abuse is always a tragedy, but it's even more of a tragedy when in lockdown, and it's a horror as well when people are unable to escape their abusers whatsoever. And that's one of the many reasons why I can never support a full lockdown like we've had across the continent in Italy and Spain, whether for domestic abuse horrors or even for things like people being able to embrace the fresh air and go to parks. I think it's vital that people have those things. $1 billion startups could get bailout too, right? And some other sports features, which I must say I'm not a sports presenter, but I try my best, right? When it's small, it's a bit tricky to read. The Times as well, one of my favourite newspapers, saying that ministers plan how to get Britain back in business. Well, quite, and this poses the conflict that's existed a lot in the media between the health and the economy, which, as I say, is too easy a way to look at it. It's not that simple. With advisors offering guidance on relaxing the lockdown. Well, it's interesting that they say advisors are doing it. Are these political advisors, scientific advisors? You know, an advisor might make a suggestion because they're ideologically opposed to the lockdown continuing or the economy being affected in the way it is. But I want, obviously, ministers have to be accountable and make the final decisions, but I want those decisions to be broadly based on the scientific projections and whether the death rate is decreasing and what the trends are showing. And what else? Oh, yes, another reason to stay in, as an asteroid apparently is racing towards the Earth, is what the Times says. So that's just, gosh, it says, brace yourself, just when you thought life under lockdown couldn't be any more challenging, a visitor from far away is about to get a little too close for comfort. Oh, dear. Well, that's something to not worry about, hopefully. I just don't know. Oh, God, that's quite concerning. And finally, for now, we'll look at some more newspapers later on. The Guardian, leading with the PM returning to face critics and talk of a new normal. Well, that is the case. I mean, going out of lockdown, I saw a tweet that said going out of lockdown is not the same as going back to normal. The two are very different things. I don't think life will probably be normal as it was before. I might get round to talking about it a bit later on, depending on how much time I have. But I think a new normal is going to be different. It'll be before coronavirus and after coronavirus, BC and AC. That's what our new measurement is going to be now, because I think it will transform our way of living. While some things might remain the same, just this period of time over these past few months and maybe for the whole of 2020, they're going to mean that we think about the world and how we live in a very different way. And scientists' fears over the PM's aid in meetings. Oh, yes, I think this links to Saturday's story that the Guardian broke, that Dominic Cummings had attended meetings of this SAGE committee, which is meant to be the independent scientific committee that that advises the government on the plans to follow. Now, I am in mixed views on this. On the one hand, I would want the Prime Minister's advisors to be in meetings relating to what scientists were saying, because obviously what scientists are saying will affect the eventual decisions that politicians make. But at the same time, I don't want that advisor affecting the meetings themselves. Now, it says that I think the broad consensus is that Dominic Cummings attended these meetings, as did advisors under Nick Clegg in the coalition years. So attending a meeting is both very different to being on a committee and actually speaking in the committee. And I'd hope that the scientists weren't indirectly or subconsciously affected over what they said by his very presence. But I think the best form of impartiality, obviously you can never get full objectivity or impartiality in these things, would be for a civil servant to sit on the committee and take minutes as to what had been said and then present those back to the Prime Minister. So there's nothing wrong with an advisor necessarily attending, but I will want what the Prime Minister sees and how they make their decision to be based on the objective minutes of what had been said, which were recorded by a civil servant potentially. And now I'll look at some more of the papers later on. I think we've got a few more to go, some of the tabloids as well, because we like to cover everything that's worth talking about. I just want to come on to something that I've spoken about before on Insight and the Johnny Jenkins show, just about the broader issue of civil liberties, really. I see myself as a big supporter of civil liberties and human freedoms. You had throughout the New Labour years various attacks on our individual freedom, which was used against the war on terror. So whether it was the introduction of ID cards, which were thankfully scrapped, the extended detention without trial, the mass rollout of CCTV, which affected the way we live, and just, we're so used to seeing them now, these cameras, but 20, 30 years ago, they just weren't there in the same number that they were. And that general sense of individuals sacrificing their freedoms to the wider community. I've always been on that sort of issue, on that debate. I've always been on the side of Amnesty, those charities that are, or Liberty, those organisations that are defending human freedoms. And yet with this, with this lockdown, all of us have been willing to sacrifice our own civil liberties for the wider community. We've had to put our own economic and personal interests and personal freedoms separate to the medical needs of everyone else in accepting this lockdown. And that's why I thought it was surprising that many Tory ministers and maybe even the Prime Minister himself want to focus on eventually leaving lockdown, because it has been one of the most popular policies ever, almost achieving cross-party support. If you wanted to find something that united the country, it would be the lockdown. But this has meant we've had to sacrifice just the freedom to move, the freedom to go out multiple times a day, to head into town. I was in town on Saturday, but nice and early in the morning, hardly anyone about at all the shops shut. The main shopping complex in the centre of Cambridge, Grand Arcade and Lion Yard, were both closed, which is extraordinary. So that just never is the case whenever you're in town. It's normally full and bustling with people. And the freedom to associate as well. I'm not religious, but many religious groups have had to resort to online church services or other religious services as well to take part in their prayer, which is obviously going to be difficult for those that haven't got access to that technology and are reliant on going to that shared worshipping space together, a place of worship within the community. And so it has been extraordinary how willing we've been to accept this. And that's been the case for governments across the world. I read somewhere that about 4.5 billion people are in some sort of lockdown measure. And I think the most important thing is accepting that this has to be the case. Of course, some people will always be opposed to lockdown, any sort of government interference within our lives. But I think one has to be pragmatic when assessing this and look at the medical needs. This is not something like an ordinary flu. It was something that could both spread far quicker and be far more dangerous as well. So it's a real balance and having to make short-term sacrifices in our freedom for hopefully long-term benefits. That's what one would have to say. I never thought I'd hear myself utter that phrase, because as I say, I'm normally against the governments being very sort of intrusive in their powers, but I understand the rationale behind doing this. And I think there always has to be the conversation about the fact we're uncomfortable in these circumstances. Maybe some people might like the lockdown if it means they're being furloughed and they can spend most of their day just watching television. I know I've been watching lots of television. If people know that they can spend their time doing that, then what's not to like for some people? But we have to worry that these freedoms that we had or have they were built up over centuries, and they can very easily, as we've seen, be reduced. So I think one of the most important things is making sure we feel uncomfortable about these freedoms, but also that we're willing to accept them, but ensure that they are eventually repealed. Now, I think within the UK, there's a sunset clause of about 6 months. That means from when the coronavirus legislation was introduced in 2020, there's 6 months between that and the date where it would either have to be abolished or eventually reviewed. I think the government, I might be wrong on this, initially wanted it to be 2 years, but that has since reduced to 6 months, which I think is reassuring. But it has to mean that the government are held to account and that this legislation is eventually repealed. And we have been willing to sacrifice these freedoms and look at, spending more time indoors, having to adapt to situations like this to work from home. But it has meant that the police, now having these laws, have used the powers that they've got. I've seen certainly videos on Twitter of the police, if not arresting people, challenging people simply for sunbathing within a park or going out and about, and maybe being within a group of people. I mean, it's obviously unclear whether the group is from within their household or not. And I think the police are having to play a really fine balance here. As I say, I support parks with beacons of the environment and beacons of the community. Many people, that will be their one green space to go jogging, to exercise with their children, to simply go for a walk and to feel within a community, within something, rather than just either within their garden or stuck on the top floor of a flat where they have no access whatsoever to any form of green space. So I think the police have to be very careful in being proportionate in their response, and not simply telling people off for going out for a walk or maybe sitting down on a bench for longer than might otherwise be expected. And as I say, it's a real balancing action. And also, you'd have had people following their sort of own lockdown measures before the government even introduced any legislation. While the government and Boris Johnson towards the end of March said we now have to go into lockdown, we have to follow these rules. Beforehand, people may have, by their own choice, not been going into lockdown, not going outdoors as much, socially distancing, being at least 2 meters away from other people. And I must say, it is, as a jogger, it is irritating when I see a whole bunch of people go along across the whole pavement, and I try and do my best to be a good pedestrian, but it's clear sometimes that you think, are these people really from the same household? And normally it's something that I wouldn't consider, normally it's something that I wouldn't take account of, but in this occasion I would do. And I'd like to think that people are following the rules themselves, and that the police's powers don't have to become even more restrictive and authoritarian. But as we're in this lockdown and recognising the benefits of it in terms of slowing the spread, I think we have to recognise that the lockdown will have consequences too, not least on our civil freedoms. There probably will be physical health issues as a result of this. As I say, I'm now speculating on this. I don't have any statistics to hand, but sort of reflecting on what I think could rationally be the consequence of this. Physically, it does mean that hospitals, they are going to be prioritising the coronavirus. It's perfectly understandable that they're doing this. This is a virus that does spread between people. We've got, I think, cases globally are now approaching 3 million. So it's a huge amount of people that have been affected, and well over 100,000 people that have tragically passed away. So it's understandable why we've had to get in this lockdown, and why other operations that are non-essential have been pushed to one side. But that does make me think I wouldn't be surprised if we saw an increase in the average deaths from conditions that weren't related to COVID-19, people that hadn't even got the virus sadly passing away because their health issue was seen as a secondary concern towards the COVID-19. Similarly, I think the lockdown could have a great impact on people's mental health, especially if they're not able to easily access the great outdoors, gardens and parks, because being inside and constricted in one place for a long time can be very worrying. I must say, I'm personally quite lucky. I enjoy my own company, so it's not too much of an issue. But for many people, they'll be relying on connections with other people. And this is, I think, especially the case for people that are in their more mature years, in their twilight years, people that are retired perhaps, and that are reliant on going out on their weekly routine, whether it's going to the bank, going to bingo, going to their university of the third age sessions. They're reliant on these interactions and communications with other people that help stimulate their minds, keep them fit and healthy in their older age. And inevitably these connections and situations that people have between one another will have had to decrease because of the coronavirus, and so that will have a damaging impact in the future. I think for younger children it could be very worrying as well if they fear going outside and they worry about meeting someone else and thinking they're going to catch a virus from them. And it links to the broader theme and broader conversation I think we need to have, which is about risk and fear. Every day when we go outside, forget the coronavirus is even happening, we have to take risks every day. We could tragically be run over, we could be involved in something. And it's about humans, giving humans the confidence and that freedom to assess the rationality and accept the risks, that they have the rationality and that they can accept the risk within their daily lives. Obviously, at the moment, when coronavirus is affecting so many people, you do need some state intervention. But more generally, I think we need to foster confidence and resilience that allows people to take account of those risks and just think rationally, what am I going to do in my day-to-day life to both keep me safe, but also ensure that I don't just stay inside the whole time. The UK also suffers from a major obesity crisis in the world, and I wouldn't be surprised if this coronavirus has made the situation worse. I know I've certainly been baking more and eating more and probably have put on weight, and I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case for other people. I have been trying to do exercise, but just from an individual perspective, it's not surprising to see how that could affect other people around the world. So I think we have to not just look at this in a binary way of the lockdown being fine in the perfect scenario. Of course, I think it probably is better than Sweden's approach. They've hardly been immune from the coronavirus by the policies that they're following. We also have to take account that the lockdown is far from a perfect solution. And the last main theme I want to talk about before I read the last of the comments and offer my last recommendations is just on the health versus the economy debate. It will be a very quick one. the economy is not simply an abstract discussion of money or some entity that exists within the world. It's about the actions that individuals make by going shopping, by working, by paying taxes. And individuals are not going to make those actions if they're unwell. So hence, I think it's really tricky to look at the health versus economy debate in a really narrow way. Governments might allow restaurants to reopen properly or other entities so that they can begin trading and trying to help get the economy back on track. But if people still decide to voluntarily not go out, then we're not going to get any sort of economic recovery. I think it's all about giving people both incentives to go out and making them assess that risk. And the economy is already in a dire state. The UK alone is about 2 trillion in debt. I think we're heading potentially for a major depression if we're going to head at least for a recession, if not a major depression. So I wouldn't be surprised if the situation gets much worse. And the economic recovery, as well as the health recovery, is a story that I think really needs considering. I have some more comments here from Lyra. Hello. Hi, Noah. Thanks very much for this nice informal morning analysis. Lyra from Spain. 2020 feels like the beginning of something could change for the better, I like to think. Well, I hope so. I think there could be maybe some positive consequences from the coronavirus, not from the virus itself, but the change we've had to adapt. Initially, I thought this could lead to people working more from home or doing more online meetings, but I have been slightly doubtful about that. Because I've been on Zoom a lot, it's very different to face-to-face meetings. I think it's a lot more potentially exhausting. You're having to really focus on other people, and the nuances you make about knowing when to interrupt and the body language that we use, it simply isn't possible online. So I wonder, until the online technology gets even better, I don't think that online Zoom meetings, when the world goes back to normal, is necessarily sustainable. I just want to look, from Alex Elbury, very kind. I really enjoyed this hour. What a great show. Looking forward to your next one. Oh, thank you, Alex. That's very kind. We'll just look through the last 2 papers, and I'll offer both my podcast recommendation and my Twitter recommendation, hopefully before the hour is up. The Daily Star this morning, let's open our pub gardens. I thought the main issue was on garden centres, which I personally haven't got much of a problem with. There can be social distancing with plants in between. And the Daily Star talking about pub gardens could reopen soon if landlords are sensible about crowd numbers. And this is from a top government scientific advisor, Sir Robert Dingwell. Well, maybe. I mean, if there can be spaces between them, I don't know how you do it, whether you just have one family per bench. But for many people, pubs are the bedrock of the community, and they're going to have been severely damaged by this, potentially if it's a pub that's been in the family for generations. So I can understand why people might want to return to their local. The Daily Mirror this morning, honour NHS heroes. Ex-leaders join the call to recognise the very best of us for sacrifice and bravery. So this is all living ex-Prime Ministers, Major, Blair Brown, Cameron and May, uniting together to give NHS coronavirus heroes a medal. Well, I mean, I think that could be potentially a lovely idea. I think we have clapped most weeks. I've clapped most weeks for NHS workers and care workers and essential workers more generally. So I see why a medal alone couldn't change things, but it could offer that sense of recognition that we appreciate what they've done in saving lives and preventing the death toll from being even worse. The Sun this morning, the Homes Front, where they've devoted on their front page to pay tribute towards workers like firefighter, binman, bus driver, shopkeeper, cleaner and district nurse. So as I say, all the key workers that are working hard to keep us safe, and that they're saluting the unsung heroes of lockdown, which I think is just brilliant, because we do need to salute them. We can have all the criticism of the structures that they operate in, whether it's the education system or the health system, but the actual workers themselves are the ones saving their lives. And finally, the Financial Times, the Bank of England warns banks on loan reserves at risk choking business funding. So as I say, more financial stories there. And the Financial Times talking about isolation will leave a dark legacy on the nation's health. Well, as I say, isolation might be necessary, but it's not the perfect answer. Now, finally, before I am off air, I want to offer both my podcast recommendation and my Twitter recommendation. So for my podcast recommendation, I'd like to recommend, yes, you've guessed it, another politics podcast, Steve Richards' Rock and Roll Politics. He's a really great guy, really expert commentator, and he sort of reflects on both the past and the present in understanding the political and social events that are shaping the world. I always feel far more informed once I finish listening to him and reflect on what he has to say. I trust his judgment and find him really astute, and he can be very wry and witty, as well as deeply informative and enjoyable. So Steve Richards, his Rock and Roll Politics podcast, he also does a live show, but he started doing his recorded podcast well, because sadly many of his live shows have been cancelled. For my tweeter of the week, this isn't a directly political tweeter or person today, so you'll be pleased to hear that. It's Susan Cowman. She's a comedian, Susan Cowman. I first saw her on Strictly Come Dancing a few years ago. It's at Susan Cowman, and I always find her tweets, which often feature pictures of cats. I was just having a look through her Twitter feed this morning, and they're very funny and witty and heartfelt and warm, and you always leave her Twitter feed feeling sort of far more happy and optimistic about the world. And you think if her Twitter feed was reflective of the world's Twitter feed, then we might all be in a better place. So at Susan Cowman for your tweet of the week, and Steve Richards' Rock and Roll Politics podcast for your podcast week. Alex Elber is saying that Alex, her show, will be interviewing Cambridge Virtual Community Centre with the Deputy Leader of Cambridge City Council on Cambridge 105 Radio, which is another fine radio station, and Deepika Baradwar having caught the last 20 minutes of this. Oh, thank you very much. That's very kind of you. But thank you all very much indeed for your company this morning. This hour has whizzed by. I don't know how I've managed to keep talking for so long, but I really enjoyed it. Thank you. It's been lovely reading the comments and hearing all your feedback and being able to express my views in these lockdown times. So I'll be back with you same time next week, Monday morning at 10 a.m. So I do hope you'll join me then. Until then, keep well and thanks for watching.